Perfect. Amazing. Moving on to character analysis. So we don't have any idea what the characters look like, but I've included some little images throughout here. So the narrator, as the lens in which we view the novel, gives us insight into the detrimental effect of disappearances to the human mind. We see that with her, we see that with other people, but definitely an insight into it nonetheless. So, when writing about characters, if you guys struggle with coming up with what to write about, maybe you lean into more summary and summarizing things, you might want to think about the narrator's choices, the narrator's goals, her values, and her trajectory. So, the trajectory of a character is kind of how they progress throughout the novel or the text, whatever you're studying. And that can be a really useful point to draw information from if you look at their characterization in that regard. So if we're looking at the narrator's trajectory, she starts off, unlike most people on the island, she actually attempts to fight the disappearances. So instead of passively accepting the change around her, she attempts to fight back, and she shelters up and writes her manuscript. She goes directly against the disappearances and what they're saying. And I think that's quite a significant point of her personality there as well, fighting against those disappearances. She, however, despite her efforts, loses the fight. In the end, we obviously know the narrator is unable to control her body, and is under the impression that it has completely disappeared. It hasn't, but we see, obviously, from her perspective, that she feels like she can disappear or float through the holes of the trapdoor with just her voice. Okay? And she develops through her relationships throughout the novel as well. So whilst her and R begin as acquaintances, they develop into a romance, and she also grows closer with the old man, and the three of them forge a close platonic relationship. And this also highlights the importance of love in times of adversity, whether it is platonic or romantic. It is a very important thing to have, and I think Ogura particularly stresses that as well. Okay, cool. So moving on to R. He is the editor who works on the narrator's manuscripts. Initially, the two don't hold that deep of a bond, but after the narrator takes him in, they gradually get closer and closer, eventually forming a love for each other, despite R being married. But clearly he didn't see his wife for quite a long time, or his child, as he was in the hidden room. But again, like the narrator, if we're looking for plot points in an essay, we can think about R's choices, goals, values, or trajectory. Okay, so R is one of the few people not impacted by the disappearances. In this sense, he juxtaposes the narrator. If we were to compare the two, I guess we can kind of get a deeper understanding of the psychological impact of the disappearances, and how they influence both those who are affected and those who aren't. Because I think they definitely take a toll on both individuals. We see him weaken physically in the hidden room, and he's quite disappointed when he sees people around him can't recall the memories that he can, and I guess there is some sense of loneliness in that as well, if you're, one of the only people who can do that. Yeah. Okay, so as the novel progresses, he becomes much more dynamic and open. He begins quite distant and quiet. However, as the novel progresses, his personality is shown through his interactions with the narrator, though it is clear that the hidden room takes a toll on him. As I said, we see that kind of his deterioration physically and mentally as well. I just talked about that there. So R's fate is left unknown at the end of the novel. Whilst he does end up leaving the hidden room after the narrator disappears, we ultimately don't know what happens to him, though it is suggested that he rejoins society, or what is left of the island, because obviously the majority of people would have forgotten that they exist, or forgotten their bodies. So the people who haven't forgotten their bodies would obviously be the people that can still remember things, and obviously maybe an interpretation of the ending could be that R had rejoined society. Okay, perfect. the old man, the narrator's late nurse's husband. So he acts as a paternal figure throughout the novel, especially in the absence of her own, as her parents have passed. And he gives guidance and solace as well throughout the novel for the narrator. Okay? So, again, thinking about essay points, we could think about the old man's choices, his goals, values, and trajectory. So, initially a ferry mechanic until the disappearance of boats. There you go. So, through these skills, he's a key component in the construction of the hidden room, where he creates the intercom as a form of communication between R and the narrator. And that's a key point of communication for them as well, when the narrator doesn't go down to the room, or she's sticking the intercom out the window so that he can hear the sound of the snow that he can't see because he's tucked away and in hiding. And during the earthquake, he was trapped under a cabinet. So this kind of forms the basis of his injuries, which, as we know, lead to his death. But it is a salient moment in the novel and promotes a period of grief for the narrator who loses another parental figure. Okay, perfect. So, the memory police. So before I kind of tap into them a bit, I have chosen this image for a reason. As I said before, the memory police are also affected by the disappearances of the items and objects around the island, and most likely, I guess from that we can infer that they were affected by the disappearance of limbs and the bodies as well. So I guess I've chosen this image to kind of represent the people behind the memory police. You know, if you're in a dictatorship or a authoritarian regime, you know, maybe there are people that don't necessarily want to do what they do, or have been forced into it for the wider kind of representation of the dictatorship. Hopefully this is making sense. But again, an interpretation. So yeah, but I think maybe we can infer something similar to that anyway. Okay, so they are dressed in identical uniforms, and this group of men, known as the memory police, act as a representative component for the state government. So they seek to destroy items that have disappeared and expose those who are not affected by the disappearances, because they want to destroy all traces, I guess. Okay. So, through the existence of the memory police, Ottawa condemns the nature of surveillance states or authoritarian regimes as well. Okay, and the woman. So these two are now the people in the excerpts, which we will explore as well. So the woman is the main character in the narrator's manuscript. So essentially, this is kind of a summary of her perspective or her growth and characterization throughout the manuscript. She falls in love with her typing teacher, who eventually locks her in a clock tower and steals her voice. She becomes dependent on him for survival. The woman deteriorates with the novel's progression and eventually becomes absorbed into the room she's held captive in. So, as the main character, there are clear parallels between the woman and the narrator. Both experience captivity. One is physical, one is psychological, and they are also similar patterns of demise and the way that you're kind of absorbed into the room that, well, the narrator wasn't held captive, but we can see how they kind of have similar fates in the end, and that's kind of why it's an allegory, okay? And then the typing teacher, so this acts as an allegory of the memory police, which illuminate parallels between the violent repression and control exhibited by both parties, okay? And in the same way the typing teacher captures the woman physically, the memory police captures the narrator psychologically. So there's that kind of differences, you know, they have their discrepancies in the story, but they both, I think, prove similar things, or they definitely have parallels that cross over, okay?